In the rolling hills of the Scottish borders, there is a town that wears its years like a tattered coat. Selkirk, stone streets, wind-scoured rooftops, the slow turning of seasons in the shadow of the hills. On the surface, it is like any other small town, ordinary in its quiet, steady way. But in certain old records, there are gaps, years where the name seems to slip through the fingers of history, as if it had been deliberately erased. The locals will not speak of those years, and if you press them, their voices grow low, their eyes turn away, and they tell you it is better not to ask, better not to stir what sleeps beneath the cobblestones. They call it the winter of '99. No one says it with ease. The words seem to catch in the throat. There are no memorials, no plaques, no carved names to remind the living. But the silence is its own kind of monument. Ask an old man in the pub, and he might give you a quick glance before muttering that the past is the past. Ask a child, and they will only repeat a rhyme, half forgotten, about 7 sisters who walked into the woods and never came back. The town itself feels heavy with the absence. The old mills stand empty, their broken windows like unblinking eyes. Photographs in dusty frames show faces long dead, the edges curling inward, the light inside them fading to yellow. The air carries the smell of wet stone and peat fires, and when the wind passes through the narrow lanes, it brings with it a sound almost like whispering. It is said that once, long ago, Selkirk was built on a crossing place, somewhere between here and somewhere else. The older folk claim you can feel it in the ground if you stand still long enough, a faint thrum beneath your feet, like the heartbeat of something deep below. They don't say what it is. They don't have to. The sisters were real. That much is certain. 7 of them, all daughters of a family who lived on the edge of town. And then, in the span of a single winter day, they were gone. No footprints, no letters, no bodies. Only their absence, settling over Selkirk like the frost that never melted that year. People say that some names should not be spoken, that some doors once closed must stay closed, but every silence has its cracks, and in Selkirk, something is still waiting to be heard. The McRae house stood apart from the rest of Selkirk, both in distance and in spirit. A sprawling estate of weathered stone and sagging roofs. Its walls were tangled in ivy, so thick it seemed to be swallowing the place whole. The windows were tall but dim, as though the light itself hesitated before entering. Alistair McRae lived there with his 7 daughters, and though no one could call them poor, they carried an air that kept others away. They did not mix in the market. They did not join in church fairs or town dances. When they walked into the village, they moved together, quiet as shadows, and left without a word. Alistair was a widower, though no one could say for certain how his wife had died. Some said fever, others whispered of something stranger, though no one dared speak the details. He was tall, with a dark, thoughtful gaze, a man who seemed to live more in his mind than in the present. His daughters mirrored him, pale, graceful, and distant, their long hair often braided with bits of ribbon or dried flowers. They had beauty, yes, but the kind that unsettles as much as it draws you in. It was not their silence alone that made the town uneasy. Etched into the door frames and beams of the McRae house were strange carvings, circles within circles, intersecting lines, and symbols that looked older than the town itself. Some claimed they were marks of protection. Others said they were meant to call something in. The designs were cut deep, as if meant to last for centuries. And then there was the singing. On certain nights when the wind fell still, neighbors swore they could hear it drifting from the estate. 7 voices, weaving together in harmonies that made the hair rise on the back of the neck. The words were in no language anyone recognized, soft, lilting phrases that seemed to pull at the mind, drawing it towards some half-remembered dream. There were old rumors in Selkirk, stories passed in quiet corners, about the McRae bloodline, about a bargain made long ago, before the town had stone streets, when the hills were wilder and the nights darker. The details had been lost or perhaps buried, but the warning remained. The McRaes carried something with them, something not meant to be touched. Most kept their distance. A few couldn't help but watch, and those who watched long enough said the same thing. The sisters moved as if they knew where they were going, even when there was nowhere to go. The year 1899 did not arrive like any other. It came heavy, as though the air itself had been warned. In June, frost clung to the grass at dawn, glistening like winter's breath had wandered into summer. Crops withered under skies that could not decide between sun and ice. Then came the fogs, thick, wet walls of grey that rolled in without wind, swallowing streets, muffling footsteps, and turning familiar lanes into corridors of nothing. Sometimes they stayed for hours, sometimes for days. When they finally lifted, it was as if the town had been holding its breath. By August, the animals began dying. First sheep on the hillsides, found stiff in the morning, with eyes wide open, as though startled by something in the dark. Then cattle, then the horses that pulled the mill carts. No wounds, no signs of illness, just a stillness that spread too quickly to be chance. One day, near noon, a farmer walking back from the market looked up and froze. There was a shadow moving across the valley, vast and slow, as though something enormous had passed between the earth and the sun. But the sky was clear. No clouds, no birds, no shape to cast it. He watched it slide over fields and rooftops, and he swore he felt the ground tremble beneath his boots. The old ones in Selkirk began speaking of the seventh turning. They said it had happened before in ways different yet the same, a cycle marked not by years but by signs, each one heavier than the last. It was in the stories their grandparents had told them, when the fire burned low and the night pressed too close to the windows, a time when doors must be locked, when songs must be stopped, and when no one should walk alone after dusk. In the final weeks before the McRae sisters vanished, the air grew close and strange. Even the skeptical felt it, the weight pressing on the lungs, the sense that eyes followed them home. The weather shifted from one hour to the next, clouds curling in unnatural spirals before breaking apart. The night smelled faintly of smoke, though no fires burned. Dogs whimpered at empty corners. Lamps flickered for no reason, and sometimes, just before they went out, people thought they heard a low hum, like a voice far beneath the floor. Something was moving through Selkirk. Not quickly, not loudly, but with the slow certainty of a shadow that never leaves. It was a Sunday afternoon, the kind of day that should have been ordinary. The church bells had only just finished their ringing, when the McRae sisters were seen, walking single file down the narrow track that led toward the edge of town. Their hands were linked, each holding on to the next, the youngest at the rear, the eldest leading. None of them carried baskets or coats, though the air was sharp with the bite of early winter. There was no hurry in their steps, no sign of fear, just a quiet, steady rhythm, as though they were following some invisible line only they could see. The first to notice was a shepherd bringing his flock in from the lower fields. He swore he heard a sound drifting with them, a low, steady hum, not quite singing, not quite the wind. It vibrated in his chest in a way that made his skin prickle. He stopped to watch them until they passed beyond the stile and into the thin strip of trees that marked the beginning of the forest. By dusk, they had not returned. The next day, the stories began to spread, each one adding to the unease. A woman gathering water claimed she saw the sisters not on the track, but in the meadow, their pale dresses moving between the tall grass before they simply faded. Not walked away, not stepped behind a hill, faded as if the light had swallowed them. Another villager told of a tall man in black, walking ahead of them, his face hidden beneath the brim of a wide hat. He said the man never looked back, yet the sisters followed close, their linked hands never breaking apart. Others swore there was no man at all. And then there were the ones who said they heard the humming too, but it was louder for them, more insistent. One man described it as a note that seemed to stretch time itself, a single tone that pulled him out of the moment, as if the world around him had slowed. The constable who took down these accounts wrote in his ledger that there was no agreement on where the sisters had been seen or how they had gone. It was as if the town itself could not decide on the truth. Some believed they had run away together, others that they had been taken, but among the oldest in Selkirk there was a quieter fear that perhaps all the stories were true, that on that Sunday afternoon the McRae sisters had stepped into something where more than one reality could unfold, and only one of them would let them leave. The search began before the sun had even set on the day the sisters vanished. Men left their suppers half-eaten, grabbing coats and boots, lanterns swinging from their hands. The constable roused the clergy, and before long, even soldiers from a nearby post joined the effort. The countryside was combed in widening circles, voices calling the sisters' names into the cold air. The shouts seemed to travel strangely, as though swallowed before they could reach far. They moved into the forest with the dogs leading the way, but the animals balked at certain places. Hackles rose, tails lowered. Some refused to move forward at all, whining and pressing against their handlers' legs. A few broke free and bolted back toward the town, leaving their leashes dragging in the mud. Lanterns glowed warm at the forest edge, but once inside the light changed. It thinned, dimming, until the faces of the searchers looked pale and hollow, as if they stood under moonlight instead of flame. No matter how high they held the lanterns, the reach of light seemed to shrink. The darkness pressed close. Days passed. The search expanded into the hills, the streams, the abandoned mill paths, and yet the forest kept drawing them back. Those who ventured deepest spoke of strange things they could not explain once they returned. A soldier swore he saw a stone archway, weathered and moss-covered, standing alone among the trees, no walls attached to it, no ruins nearby. When he stepped closer, he found that the space beyond the arch was darker than the rest of the woods, so dark he could not see the other side. A farmer said he heard a girl's voice calling his name from somewhere ahead, soft at first, then clearer, almost familiar. But when he followed it, the sound moved, always just beyond reach. He chased it until he realized the voice was now behind him. Some came back pale and shaking, refusing to speak of what they had seen. One man left Selkirk entirely the next morning, abandoning his farm. After the third week, the town began to understand something none of them wanted to say aloud. This was not a search like any other. They were not walking into empty woods. They were walking into a place that seemed to change when they stepped inside it. Paths looped back on themselves. Landmarks appeared where they had not been before. The forest, it seemed, did not want them to find the sisters. And somewhere within that darkness, something else was moving, slower than the searchers, but far more patient. A month after the sisters were gone, Reverend Thomas Aiken left Selkirk without a sermon, without a word of goodbye. One Sunday he stood at the pulpit, his voice steady but pale, and by the next morning his house was empty, his study stripped of books, his desk bare. The townspeople spoke of him in low tones after that. Some said grief had broken him, others thought he'd simply lost his faith. It was decades before the truth began to surface. In the winter of 1937, a carpenter renovating an old manse in Edinburgh found a false panel in the back of a cupboard. Behind it lay a bundle of pages bound in twine, the ink faded but still legible. The handwriting was Aiken's. They were fragments, torn, smudged, as though parts had been destroyed in a hurry, but what remained was enough to stir old fears. In his notes, Aiken described private meetings with the McRae sisters in the weeks before they vanished. They had come to him together, unannounced, their faces pale and watchful. They told him of dreams that felt less like dreams and more like visits to a place they could not name. In these visions, they stood before what they called the gate. The gate, they said, was not a door in the ordinary sense, but a shape in the air, tall and narrow, framed in shadow. Beyond it was only blackness, though sometimes they thought they saw movement deep within. They told him they could feel something on the other side, pressing closer each time they dreamed. It was not walking toward them, but sliding, as if carried on a current they could not see. One sister had said it plainly. It wants through. Aiken Sepp's writings grew stranger as they went on. He wrote of a heaviness in the room when they spoke, of the way the air seemed colder near the youngest girl. He recorded a single line, written in larger, jagged script. If the gate opens, it will not close again. There was a final entry, dated just days before his sudden departure. It simply read, "They are not afraid for themselves. They are afraid for us." After that, the pages ended. No one knows why Aiken left, or whether he tried to warn anyone beyond his journal. But those who have read the fragments all agree on one thing: whatever the sisters had seen, they had seen it together, and they had known it was coming for more than just them. After the sisters were gone, the McRae estate stood like a wound at the edge of Selkirk. The windows were shuttered within days, heavy boards nailed across the glass. The front gate was chained. No buyers came forward, and by the turn of the century, the place had begun to sink into itself, as though the weight of its own history was pulling it down. Roof tiles slipped loose. Gutters sagged. The gardens, once kept in neat, winding paths, grew wild and choked the stone steps in green. By 1901, ivy had swallowed entire walls, its roots prying into cracks in the mortar. The front door hung crooked on its hinges. When the wind blew in from the hills, it made the loose shutters rattle like teeth. Children from the town dared each other to go inside. Most made it only as far as the porch, before the silence pressed too heavy on their chests. The few who went further came back pale and breathless, swearing the rooms did not stay the same shape from one moment to the next. Visitors spoke of strange drafts inside, gusts of air that came without warning, carrying the smell of seawater, sharp and cold, as if the tide had just gone out. Sometimes it was faint, like a memory. Other times it filled the halls, so strong it stung the eyes. There was no water for miles. And then there were the walls. More than one person claimed they shifted, not visibly, not like doors swinging open, but subtly, as though the house were breathing. Corridors that should have been straight bent, ever so slightly, just enough to make you lose your bearings. A doorway that had been there an hour before might lead into a different room entirely. The older folk muttered that the land itself was to blame, that the house had been built in a place it should not have been. Others whispered it had been changed by whatever had taken the sisters, left marked in a way that could never be undone. For years it sat there, drawing the curious and the foolish, and every so often someone would emerge from its shadow with eyes wide and unblinking, swearing they had heard footsteps in the rooms above them, though the boards had been stripped bare, and no one had walked those halls in years. The McRae estate was empty, but it was not still, and for those who crossed its threshold, the question was never what they might find inside, but whether the house might find them. The forest where the sisters were last seen has not always been there. Old maps, drawn in careful ink during the 1700s, show nothing but open pasture land stretching from the town's edge to the hills beyond. Even as late as 1820, records describe the ground as flat and bare, used for grazing sheep. And yet now, where the pastures once rolled, a dense wall of trees stands, thick and dark, as if it had been there for centuries. The trees are wrong. That is what the locals say. They rise too fast, too tall, their trunks smooth and pale in some places, twisted and knotted in others. The roots break through the soil in spirals, curling back into the ground as if burrowing deeper. Botanists who have visited speak of growth rates that make no sense, rings too close together, seasons of rapid expansion that defy weather or soil conditions. No one has ever been able to name the species. The air changes when you step beneath the canopy. The light fades more quickly than it should, dimming to an amber haze that seems to come from nowhere. Even on still days, the branches sway slightly, as though stirred by a wind from far away. Birds fall silent in its shade, their song fading into a quiet so complete it feels alive. Among the townsfolk, The term has passed down for generations, the wandering grove. They say it is not fixed in one place, that every few decades it appears somewhere new. Sometimes it shrinks, sometimes it spreads. Those who live nearest swear it shifts overnight, the tree line moving by a few feet, as if creeping forward. Some believe it is a place that does not entirely belong to this world, that stepping inside is less like crossing into a forest and more like crossing a threshold. And if the forest chooses to keep you, it will not return you to the same place or the same time you left. When the McRae sisters walked that Sunday afternoon, it was into those trees. The stories say they entered without hesitation, their hands linked, their heads slightly bowed, as if in recognition. Perhaps they knew where they were going. Perhaps the forest had been waiting for them. What is certain is this: the path they took cannot be found now. The trees stand thicker than ever, the ground beneath them soft and strange, and no matter how far you walk, you will never find the exact place where they stepped out of sight. It was unearthed by accident, long after the McRae estate had fallen into ruin. A gardener clearing the overgrown grounds struck something hard just beneath the soil. At first he thought it was a small tin, rusted and useless. But when he brushed away the dirt, he found an ornate music box, its brass dulled and its carvings faint beneath the corrosion of years. The lid bore the faint outline of a seven-pointed star, nearly worn away. It was taken into town, passed from one pair of hands to another, until someone managed to wind it. The mechanism groaned, catching on gears that had stiffened with age, but then, hesitantly, the music began. It was a lullaby, or at least it seemed to be, soft, slow notes, rising and falling in a pattern just on the edge of memory. Yet something about it felt unfinished. The melody stopped abruptly, as though a final phrase had been cut away. The sound lingered in the air for longer than it should have, fading into silence that seemed too deep for such a small object. Decades later, during a brief surge of academic interest in the McRae case, the box was brought to a sound lab in Edinburgh. Technicians cleaned and repaired the mechanism, recording the tune with modern equipment. That was when they noticed it, buried beneath the audible notes, at a frequency just low enough to slip past most human ears, was a second sound. It was not mechanical, not the scrape of gears or the whisper of springs. It was steady, deliberate, almost like a voice murmuring in a language no one could place. Some claimed to hear words in it, others only a tone that made the skin prickle and the stomach tighten. A few refused to listen a second time. The scholars argued. Some said it was nothing more than a recording anomaly, a quirk of decayed metal and time. Others insisted it had been put there on purpose, an undercurrent meant to be felt rather than heard. The music box passed into private hands. After that, and with it came the stories. A man who listened too long was found wandering the hills in the early hours, shivering and unable to remember his own name. A woman swore she heard the tune playing from her cellar at night, though the box had been locked in another room. It remains somewhere, still able to play its fractured song, and those who have heard it say the final notes are not missing at all. They are simply waiting to be heard by the right ears. The records should have been there, stacked in neat ledgers, ink entries marking each day of 1899 as the constables went about their duties. But when researchers searched the Selkirk police archives decades later, they found a gap. Not just missing pages, but an entire year gone. The binding of the ledger for that year was intact, yet the paper had been cleanly removed, as if sliced away with a blade. No explanation. No surviving copies, only a silence where the record should have been. The absence was too precise to be an accident. Pages do not simply vanish without someone's hand in it. When approached in their later years, a few retired officers would speak only in careful hints. One said there had been certain pressures from higher up, orders not to dig too deep. Another, more hesitant, muttered that the missing sisters were not the only ones. He would not explain further. It was a single private letter, found in a family's attic, that cast the longest shadow. Written by Constable James Kerr to his brother in Glasgow, it was dated November 1899, just weeks after the sisters disappeared. His handwriting was hurried, his lines uneven. "I am told to put nothing in the books," he wrote. "We are to say, they are gone, but no mention of what was seen in the search. I cannot stop thinking of it, though God knows I have tried. There was a place in the forest, and a thing in it. It was not made by him. It moved without sound, and yet I felt it all around me, in my bones. They said it was not to be spoken of, not even to my own mind, but I see it still when I close my eyes." Kerr's letter ended abruptly, the ink blotted mid-sentence, as if he had been interrupted. He remained in Selkirk until his death in 1912, never again speaking of the sisters, the forest, or the winter of '99. The more the archives were examined, the clearer it became that someone had wanted the year erased. Not forgotten naturally over time, but removed deliberately. Whatever had happened in those months was meant to vanish from history, preserved only in scattered, fragile whispers. And in those whispers there is a pattern, one that suggests the McRae sisters were not the first to disappear. Others had gone before them, their names lost to the same empty space in the records. The official story was one of tragedy, but beneath it lay another truth, one that the town, and perhaps more than the town, decided was better left in darkness. The story of the McRae sisters did not begin in Selkirk. Not truly. Long before their names were spoken in the narrow streets, there were other stories, older, stranger, woven into the fabric of the North. Folklorists who came to study the disappearance found echoes of it in places the sisters had never seen. In the sagas, carried from Norway's frozen coast, there is the tale of the Havfru's call. 7 maidens of a fishing village were said to have followed a song rising from the sea. They walked into the surf, hand in hand, never to be seen again. Years later, on still nights, fishermen claimed to hear laughter floating over the waves, soft, lilting, and in perfect harmony. In the Celtic ballads of the Western Isles, another story appears. It tells of the 7 of Caer Dun, daughters of a chieftain, who vanished on the eve of midsummer. Witnesses swore they were led into the hills by a man in a dark cloak. The next morning, the entrance to the glen where they had gone was gone as well, sealed by rock and grass as if it had never existed. Yet the shepherds who grazed nearby said they could hear singing from within the hill when the wind turned just right. The Gaelic storytellers called such vanishings the taking, a phrase heavy with implication. It was never said who, or what, did the taking, only that those taken did not die, in the ordinary sense. They were elsewhere, alive, but unreachable. One Highland folktale told of a wandering forest that appeared overnight, thick and green, where there had been none. 7 girls were said to have entered it to pick flowers. By the time the villagers followed, the trees were gone, and the ground where they had stood was bare. Yet for generations, whenever mist clung to that stretch of land, voices could be heard just beyond sight. The parallels were impossible to dismiss. 7 women, a place that does not stay fixed, a vanishing that leaves no trace, only echoes, and always, always, the sound of song or laughter, carrying into the years as though time had not touched it. Some scholars, cautious and unwilling to name the supernatural, suggested these were simply cultural echoes, repeating images born from the human need to explain loss. Others, more willing to see beyond the page, began to wonder if these were not stories at all, but records, fragments of a pattern unfolding over centuries, across lands and languages. When they placed the McRae sisters' story alongside the others, it did not stand out. It fit too neatly, as if it had been waiting for its turn in a cycle older than the town, older even than the country. If that is true, then Selkirk was never the beginning. It was only the place where the pattern came to claim its next 7. The shepherd's first story had been simple. He'd seen the McRae sisters walking toward the woods, their hands linked, their steps calm and steady. That was all he'd ever told the constable. all he'd ever repeated in the years after. But time has a way of pressing on the mind, loosening what a man keeps locked away. It was decades later, in a low, dim room that smelled faintly of peat smoke, when the truth began to slip from him. He was an old man by then, his voice thin, his eyes clouded, but still sharp enough to hold the weight of memory. With the parish priest beside his bed, he said there was more. He had followed them, not for long, only far enough to feel uneasy at how little sound they made. Even in the frost-bitten grass, their steps were silent. The humming reached him faintly, pulling him further into the trees, until he came to a clearing he swore he had never seen before. There in the center stood a door, not a gate, not an arch, just a single weather-worn wooden door standing upright, with no frame to hold it, no hinges to connect it to anything else. The wood was rotting, its surface furred with moss, yet it seemed intact, as if the decay could never finish its work. Beyond it was nothing. Not darkness the way night falls, but a black so deep it seemed to drink the light from the air around it. It hurt to look at for too long. The sisters stopped before it, still hand in hand. The eldest touched the handle, and the shepherd thought he saw her mouth move, though he could not hear the words. Then she stepped through, and was gone. No sound, no resistance. The others followed, one by one, until the youngest crossed, and the door stood alone. A moment later, it vanished. There was no burst of light, no puff of smoke, only a sudden absence, as if it had never been there at all. The clearing seemed smaller now, the air colder. The shepherd said he had stood there for a long time, waiting for something to happen, but nothing did. Eventually he turned back, unsure if he'd imagined the whole thing. He had told no one, not even his wife, fearing they would think him mad. His voice faltered as he finished the confession. "I think," he whispered, "they knew it would be there. I think it was waiting for them." Then he closed his eyes and said no more. In the days before the sisters vanished, people in Selkirk began to notice a stranger. He was tall, taller than most men in the town, and always dressed in black, from hat to boots. His coat hung long, brushing against his knees, and the brim of his hat cast his face in shadow. No one could quite describe his features. Some said his skin was pale. Others swore they saw a darkness in his eyes that made them look away too quickly. He was first seen standing at the gate of the McRae estate, his gloved hands resting lightly on the iron bars. A farmhand passing by said he didn't move or speak, only turned his head slightly as if following something far off. The next day, he was spotted again, this time walking the lane that led toward the hills, his pace unhurried, his gaze fixed straight ahead. No one in town knew him. He didn't lodge at the inn, didn't eat at the public house, didn't speak to the shopkeepers, yet he was seen more than once, always near the estate or the paths leading into the forest. One witness described the feeling of looking at him as like staring into a storm. Not the storm you see on the horizon, but the one you're already standing inside, where the air is charged and every sound is swallowed by the wind. Another said it was not that the man was frightening, but that the world seemed wrong in his presence, as if something beneath the surface had shifted slightly out of place. And then, after the sisters disappeared, he was gone. No one recalled seeing him leave, and no tracks were found. When folklorists began to dig into the McRae mystery years later, they found mention of similar figures in older vanishings across Scotland. In the Highlands, he was the man in the cloak, seen before the loss of the Seven of Caerdun. In a fishing village on the east coast, he was the watcher, standing at the edge of the pier the night 7 women walked into the waves. Always tall, always in black, always gone without a trace after the event. Some say he is an agent, human or otherwise, sent to guide the chosen toward their fate. Others believe he is the fate itself, wearing a form that will not draw panic until it is too late. Whatever his nature, in Selkirk his presence lasted only a few days. But those who saw him remember that strange stillness, the way the air seemed to hold its breath, And they wonder if the sisters, when they saw him, already knew who he was, or what. The morning after the sisters vanished, Selkirk awoke to a silence so complete it felt unnatural. At first, people noticed it in passing, the absence of the wind-rattling shutters, the stillness of branches outside their windows. But as the hours passed, the weight of it began to press in. Birds were gone from the air, not just quiet but absent, as if they had taken flight in the night and never returned. Chickens in their coops sat motionless, heads tucked beneath their wings. The sheep in the fields stood in clusters, watching nothing, their jaws still. Even the river, which had always run with a restless babble, seemed muted, its sound smothered before it could reach the ear. Some described the quiet as peaceful, almost sacred. Others felt it as a threat, a wrongness that seeped into the skin. A few spoke of a sensation that replaced the missing sound, a low, metallic ringing that seemed to come from inside the skull rather than the air. It wasn't constant, but it pulsed faintly, as if keeping time with a heartbeat that wasn't their own. Children began to cry without knowing why. Dogs paced and whined, their nails clicking on the floorboards, their eyes fixed on corners of the room where nothing stood. In the market, people spoke in whispers without meaning to, their voices sounding too loud against the stillness. The silence lasted from dawn until nearly dusk. When it finally broke, it was subtle at first, a rustle in the grass, the flutter of a sparrow returning to the rooftops. But those who had felt the weight of it knew something had ended in that moment, something that had been holding its breath, and then, at last, let go. In later years, scientists with no interest in folklore suggested that what happened that day could be explained by infrasound, low-frequency vibrations caused by seismic activity or atmospheric pressure shifts. These sounds, though too deep to be heard, can unsettle the body, cause unease, and even distort perception. But the explanation never settled in the minds of the townsfolk. To them, it was not weather or accident. It was the moment the veil closed. The elders spoke of it often, passing the memory down to their children as both a warning and a mystery. Remember the quiet, they would say, their eyes distant. It means something has passed and nothing will be the same after. And in Selkirk, that silence became a marker in time, the space between what the town had been before the sisters vanished and what it became after. It was in the spring of 1924, when workmen were sent to strip what remained of the McRae estate, that the letters came to light. The floors in the east wing had rotted through, and as the boards were pried up, a small wooden box slid free from the dust and splinters. Its lid was sealed with wax, long hardened and cracked, as though it had been closed in great haste. Inside were letters, 24 of them, each folded and tied with thread, none addressed, none signed. The paper was brittle, the ink browned with age, but the words were still legible. They were written in an archaic Scots dialect, the kind used in old prayer books, with turns of phrase that felt more like incantations than conversation. Most read like pleas, desperate, urgent lines repeated again and again. Keep the gate closed. Do not let it turn. Bind the circle before the solstice. There was no explanation for what the gate was, or why it needed to be bound. But the tone was clear. Whoever had written them was afraid. The handwriting was compared to surviving scraps from the McRae family, a note left by the eldest daughter, a page from the youngest's copybook, and the match was unmistakable. At least 3 different hands had written the letters, all belonging to the sisters. The dates on them were from the months leading up to their disappearance. Some were written in a fevered rush, ink smeared where the pen had caught on the page. Others were painstakingly neat, as if the writer feared the wrong word or stroke would undo whatever protection they hoped to secure. In one, a single sentence was written 20 times over. If it opens, we cannot close it. A few letters hinted at ritual, circles drawn in ash, charms buried at the forest edge, objects burned, and their smoke carried toward the hills. But they never named the thing they feared, only referred to it in fragments: the shadow behind the glass, the mouth without breath, the other side. Why the letters were hidden beneath the floor remains unanswered. Perhaps they were meant to be found after the danger had passed. Perhaps they were meant never to be found at all. In Selkirk, those who believe in the darker threads of the story see the letters not just as warnings, but as proof that the sisters knew exactly what they were walking toward, and that they had tried, until the very last, to keep it from crossing over. It is not written in the ledgers. In the official accounts of the search for the McRae sisters, the second week passes without incident. But those who have inherited the truth say otherwise. 2 men went into the woods that week and never returned. Their names are not recorded, but in whispered family histories they are remembered. Robert Cuthbert, a miller's son, and Hugh Linton, a farmhand from the northern fields. Both were strong men, accustomed to the hard work of the land. They were part of a search party, combing a deep stretch of the forest where the lantern light faded quickly. It was a cold, overcast afternoon when the others realized the two had fallen behind. At first they thought nothing of it. Searchers often drifted apart before regrouping, but when their calls went unanswered, unease began to spread. The party searched until nightfall, shouting their names into the dark. No trace, no footprints, not even the sound of movement in the undergrowth. By morning, word had reached the constable, who sent more men into the forest. This is where the stories split. In the town's telling, the search turned up nothing at all, but in the memories kept behind closed doors, there is a darker version. A descendant of one of the searchers swore his grandfather had been among those who found something. Not bodies, not in the way one expects, but pieces, fragments of clothing snagged on branches, a boot half buried in soil that looked disturbed, and something else entirely, something he refused to describe, except to say it wasn't meant for this world. Another family's story claims the men were found intact, but wrong. Their faces bore no recognition, their eyes fixed on something beyond sight. They did not speak, did not blink, only stood until they were led away, and then by the next morning they were gone from their beds. No one saw them leave. Whatever was found, or not found, was kept quiet. Their names were omitted from the reports, their absence unmarked in the town records. It was as if Robert Cuthbert and Hugh Linton had never existed. Only the families remembered, passing the truth like a relic from one generation to the next. The silence around their disappearance was deeper than fear. It was agreement. The search for the McRae sisters had already taken enough from Selkirk. The forest was not going to give anything back, and those who had looked too closely at its secrets had paid the price. Even now, in certain households, their names are spoken only in whispers. Not out of grief alone, but because some believe that to call them too loudly might let the forest hear. On the oldest maps of the Selkirk Hills, there is a mark not found on any modern survey, a small round rise, labelled simply as the Mound. By 1899, it was barely more than a swell in the earth, overgrown with grass and heather, easy to overlook, unless you knew where to stand. But the elders remembered. They called it the Hollow Hill, and they spoke of it the way others speak of deep water, never carelessly, never without a glance over the shoulder. Folklore said it was a Sidhe mound, one of the ancient doorways to the otherworld. Stories told of lights glimmering above it on winter nights, of music drifting up from the soil when the air was still. To linger there after dusk was to court trouble, for the Sidhe were said to be jealous of their realm and those who crossed into it. When the McRae sisters vanished, some in the town whispered that the hill might be tied to their fate. It lay not far from the path they were last seen on, a quiet landmark in the shadow of the forest. The connection might have remained only rumor, if not for what happened the following year. In the summer of 1900, a small group of men decided to dig into the mound. They claimed it was curiosity, though others believed it was greed, a hope for gold or relics buried long before Selkirk existed. They brought shovels and picks, but the work did not go as planned. The soil was stubborn, heavy with stone. Their tools struck something hard just beneath the surface, and shattered. The metal split cleanly, as if it had been struck by more than rock. Then they found it, a narrow opening, no wider than a man's shoulders, slanting down into the earth. A cold breath of air rose from it, carrying a scent like wet stone, and something older still. One of the men, a mason named Ewan Forrester, crouched to peer inside. Without a word, he slipped into the opening, his boots disappearing into the dark. The others called to him, but there was no answer. Moments later, the ground shuddered, and the soil collapsed, sealing the hole as if it had never been there. They dug until their hands bled, but the opening was gone. Ewan Forrester was never seen again. His name joined the town's unspoken list of the lost, and for those who believed in such things, the connection between the Hollow Hill and the McRae sisters was no longer a matter of folklore. It was a warning. Some doors are not built to be opened from this side. The first fog came in late January, weeks after the sisters were gone. It rolled in without warning, spilling over the hills and into the town as if poured from some vast, unseen vessel. By morning, Selkirk was smothered in grey. The streets vanished a few steps ahead. Lamps glowed dim and orange, their light swallowed before it could reach the ground. At first it seemed only a trick of weather. Thick, yes, but not unheard of in winter. Yet it stayed. 2 days passed, then 3, and still the fog clung to the town. Sound carried strangely through it, footsteps echoing where no one walked. People began to speak of shapes, moving within the haze. Not the quick dart of shadows, but figures, tall, still forms that stood just far enough away to be uncertain. Some swore they recognized the sisters, their pale faces faintly lit, their dresses drifting in folds that the wind did not touch. Others claimed the shapes were wrong in proportion, too long in the arms, too narrow in the head, as if something was wearing a human outline without knowing exactly how it should fit. When the fog finally lifted, the air felt thin, as if the town had been holding its breath. But it returned again and again. Sometimes it lasted only a night. Sometimes it lingered for nearly a week. It began to feel less like weather and more like a presence, something that came when it wished and left the same way. The effect on Selkirk was slow but certain. People stopped going out after dark. Windows stayed latched even in the day. The mill workers spoke less during their shifts, their eyes drifting to the streets outside as if they expected to see someone standing there, half hidden in the grey. Children grew restless, their games turning quiet and strange. In the pubs, men muttered of feeling watched, even in their own homes. A widow on the West Road claimed she woke to find her bedroom thick with mist, her breath clouding before her face, though the windows were shut tight. She said there was a figure at the end of her bed, and that it leaned forward, as if to speak before vanishing into nothing. By spring, the fog had become part of the rhythm of the town, as inevitable as the turning of the seasons. But in Selkirk, no one mistook it for something natural. It was a reminder that whatever had taken the sisters had not gone far, and perhaps it was not done watching. He arrived without warning in the summer of 1911, stepping off the coach with a battered case and a face that seemed to know too much. He gave no surname, only the name Alaric, and said he had come for the sisters. Word spread quickly through Selkirk, half as gossip, half as a shiver. He claimed he could bring them back, not their bodies, but the sisters themselves, whole and living. Alaric was no showman. He spoke plainly, without flourish, his voice low and certain. He asked for nothing in payment, only for a place where the forest met open ground, and for those who wished to witness to stand well back. That August, under a thin moon, a small group gathered at the edge of the woods. The air was close, still heavy with the day's heat. Alaric set down his case, and from it he drew objects the onlookers could not name, stones marked with strange lines, a bowl carved from dark wood, candles that burned with a faint, almost greenish flame. He began to speak in a language none recognized. The syllables rose and fell in an uneven rhythm, like waves striking rock. As he worked, the witnesses said, the air seemed to tighten, as if the space around them was narrowing. A wind came from the forest, cold and smelling faintly of salt water. When the candles burned low, Alaric's voice grew urgent. He poured something into the bowl, liquid that shimmered without reflecting the moon, and held it high. Then he stopped. His head jerked up, as though he'd heard something none of them could, and the witnesses saw his expression twist from focus to horror. He screamed. The sound was sharp, raw, cut short, as his eyes darkened, not with shadow, but with a solid black that swallowed all trace of white or iris. The bowl fell from his hands, spilling into the grass, and he crumpled where he stood. For a heartbeat, the clearing was silent. Then it came, a sound from somewhere far away, high and thin, like voices calling through deep water. Some swore they heard the sisters' names in the mix, others only a chorus of pleading cries that faded as quickly as they rose. No one touched Alaric's body until dawn. By then his skin was cold, his eyes still fixed in that unnatural black. The constable called it a seizure. The witnesses called it something else entirely. And in the years since, those who were there agree on only one thing: Alaric had reached them, but something else had reached him first. By the 1930s, the McRae name had thinned to a single thread. Margaret McRae was the last of them, a distant cousin who lived alone in a small stone cottage far from the center of Selkirk. The townspeople rarely saw her. She bought her food and coal in silence, kept no company, and let her garden run wild. What they did know was that she painted. Her canvases, when she allowed anyone to see them, were unlike anything the town had known. They were landscapes, yet not of anywhere that could be found on a map. Skies in colors that did not belong to this world. Hills bent in strange, impossible arcs. Oceans that seemed to tilt toward the viewer. And always, somewhere in the scene, a shape, a door, a shadow, a figure standing just at the edge of sight. In 1934, a pair of folklorists from Edinburgh sought her out. They had been gathering accounts of the McRae sisters, and Margaret, as the last living relative, was their final hope for something first-hand. She allowed them inside without expression, her house dim and smelling faintly of turpentine. They asked her what she thought had happened to the sisters. For a long time, she said nothing. Then she gave a small, almost weary smile. "They are safe," she told them, "but they are not alive." When pressed, she shook her head. "You wouldn't set understand. I barely do. They walked where we cannot go, and they can set come back." Her eyes, one of the folklorists later wrote, had a distant shine, as if they were reflecting something behind me, far away. 3 days later, Margaret was found in the river. She had been seen the night before, walking the banks alone in a thin dress, despite the cold. By morning, her body was caught against the stones near the bridge. The constable ruled it an accident, a misstep on wet ground. In her cottage, on the easel by the window, was a single, unfinished canvas. It was different from her others, more precise, more deliberate. It showed a clearing beneath a sky, the color of faded copper. In the center stood a door, not a building, not a gate, just a freestanding wooden door, old and warped, with no frame to hold it upright. Its handle gleamed faintly, though no light touched it. The shepherd's story, the one he had told only at the end of his life, now had its twin in paint, and whatever Margaret had seen or known had followed her to the water's edge. The river had taken her, but her last image remained, a silent witness to a place that should not exist. In the years after the McRae sisters vanished, Selkirk did what many towns do when faced with something it cannot explain. It turned away. At first it was quiet grief, an unspoken agreement not to dwell on what had happened. But over the decades, that silence became something sharper, deliberate. The town's leadership began to erase the sisters from its own history. Public records mentioning their names were quietly removed. Newspaper clippings vanished from archives. The constable's reports, what little survived, were stored in locked drawers no one could access without permission that was never given. By the 1950s, the event was no longer mentioned in schools. Generations grew up, never hearing the story in classrooms, never seeing the sisters' faces in the fading photographs that still existed in private homes. It was as though Selkirk had decided the winter of '99 was an illness that could be cut out by starving it of words. The official explanation, when pressed, was vague. An unfortunate disappearance, tragic but ordinary. Those who asked too many questions were told the details had been lost, that nothing unusual had happened at all. Over time, most stopped asking. And yet, not everyone agreed to forget. In the back corners of the pubs, in the quiet of late-night kitchens, a few old voices kept the story alive. They spoke of the fogs, of the gate, of the last time the sisters were seen walking hand in hand toward the woods. They told their children, who told theirs, though each retelling came with its own twists, its own shadows. What began as truth became folklore, and folklore, when fed only in secret, changes shape. By the time researchers came in the late 20th century, they found not one story, but dozens, each with different endings, each with its own ghosts. In some, the sisters had been taken by the Sidhi. In others, they had chosen to go, stepping through the door willingly. The leadership still resists speaking of them. Town meetings fall silent at their mention. Historical tours skip that winter entirely. It is as if Selkirk believes that by refusing to name the thing, it can keep it from returning. But the fragments remain, scattered among those who never stopped listening. And in those fragments, there is still enough to see the outline of what happened. The McRae sisters are gone. The truth is buried. And yet, beneath the quiet streets and the polite smiles, the story waits, because some things cannot be buried deep enough to die. When researchers began to dig deeper into the McRae case, they expected to find only what belonged to Selkirk, its silences, its gaps, its whispered tales. But the further they looked, the more the story began to repeat itself, far beyond the Scottish borders. In a village in Brittany, France, records from 1847 tell of 7 sisters who vanished during a storm that came without rain or wind. Witnesses claimed the air shimmered, as if seen through heat, though it was midwinter. Days later, a hunter found a wooden door standing in the middle of a glade, too new to have been abandoned, too old to have been built overnight. When he returned with others, it was gone. In the Carpathian Mountains, an 1812 account speaks of 7 women from a single hamlet walking into the mist and never emerging. The shepherd who followed them described hearing their laughter from ahead and behind at the same time. That night, the sky was so silent that dogs refused to bark, and the moon appeared twice in the same sky, once above the mountain and once reflected in the air as if on glass. In rural Ireland, a famine-era ballad tells of the 7 at the Hill of Glass, women who stepped through a shining frame and were taken to the other side of the turning world. The song says their voices could still be heard in the wind on certain nights, urging others not to follow. The pattern was always the same. 7 women or girls, a threshold, sometimes a door, sometimes an arch, sometimes only a shimmer in the air, a disturbance in the natural order, silence, strange light, impossible reflections, or fog that lingered too long, and then nothing, no bodies, no return. Scholars who dared to group these events together began to see them not as isolated tragedies, but as chapters in a phenomenon older than memory. The cycle could be centuries long, striking in places that had no connection, except for the shape of the loss. In Selkirk, the details fit too neatly to ignore. The sisters, the freestanding door described by the shepherd, the silence that fell over the town, the fog that followed, it was all there, laid out like a pattern stitched into the fabric of the world. The most unsettling theory was the simplest, that the McRae sisters had not been chosen at random. that every place in its turn offered 7, and when the time comes, something comes to collect them. What that something is, human, divine, or neither, remains unanswered. But if the pattern holds, Selkirk was not the end. Somewhere, another 7 are already walking toward their door. The forest where the McRae sisters were last seen has changed, yet not enough to forget. The trees still stand close together, their trunks leaning as though listening to one another. Moss carpets the ground in thick swells, swallowing the paths until they vanish beneath your feet. On certain days, the air feels heavier there, as if it has been waiting. In recent years, researchers have brought equipment into the woods, hoping to measure what cannot be seen. EMF meters spike without cause, their readings climbing in places where there is no power source for miles. Cameras left to record overnight return with missing minutes, stretches of blackness on the footage, the sound replaced by a low hum that deepens until it cuts out altogether. One team reported hearing voices faintly through their headsets, though no one was speaking. The words were unclear, but the cadence was familiar, rising and falling in a way that made one of the older locals pale and say, "That's how they sang." Even for those who come without instruments, the forest is not quiet. Step far enough in, and the air begins to carry small sounds you can't place. A footstep on leaves where no one walks, a knock on wood in the distance, a soft intake of breath close to your ear. The temperature drops in patches, not evenly, as though you are moving through pockets of another season. Standing there, it is easy to imagine the clearing the shepherd described, the freestanding door with its rotting wood and impossible blackness beyond. You look for it without meaning to, scanning between the trees, certain you will glimpse its edge. Some believe the gate never closed, that whatever it was, whatever lay on the other side, remains open in some form, invisible until it chooses to be seen. If the pattern is real, if the disappearances across centuries are truly linked, then the gate does not take only once. It waits. And if it waits, it will open again, for another 7, another season, where the air turns wrong, and the ground hums beneath your feet. No one knows whether the McRae sisters were taken against their will, or whether they stepped forward with purpose, hand in hand, into the dark. Perhaps they had been preparing for it all along. Perhaps they knew exactly where they were going. The forest does not answer. It only stands, patient, rooted in the soil of Selkirk. But for those who walk too far into its shade, there is a feeling, a certainty, that the story is not over, and somewhere ahead, the gate is still waiting.